The time is always right to do what is right. Happy Martin Luther King Day. Today is January 15th, 2024. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have been 95 years old this year. He was assassinated in 1968 when he was just 39 years old. Today is the third Monday of January, and we celebrate Martin Luther King Day on this day in the United States. But why is it important to commemorate this day? We don't have many national holidays that recognize a individual person. Well, on November 2nd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill making the third Monday in January a federal holiday in observance of Dr. King's birthday. The holiday became official in 1986. In some states, the day is also known as Civil Rights Day or Equality Day. Accepting the King holiday was controversial in many states. The state where I live now, Arizona, was one of the last states to approve the holiday in 1992. But by the year 2000, all 50 states officially recognized Martin Luther King Day, or MLK Day. MLK Day should not only be a day to reflect on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and listen to his I Have a Dream speech, but it should also be a day to remember what he stood for in his life, the struggle for civil rights. It is a struggle that continues in our country and across the world to this day. We also remember that although Dr. King was a powerful voice and leader for the civil rights movement, there were many other heroes, seen and unseen, in the fight for civil rights. So today we also recognize those who risked their lives and those who also lost their lives for justice. Today, I want to share with you from two different books. I'll only share excerpts from each book because they're so long. But the first book is The Story of Martin Luther King Jr., a biography for new readers. It's written by Christine Platt and illustrated by Steffi Walthall. This book is a very good study book about Dr. King's life for children ages 8 to about 10. It has illustrations and a lot of timelines and maps. It has a glossary at the end and even some questions to test your knowledge about what you've read. I will be adding some photographs from this book. This is one of the books that I like to look at that illustrates some events in the civil rights movement. It has great photographs, and being a former photographer myself, I really appreciate how photographs make you feel like you went back in time. The name of this book is Mine Eyes Have Seen, Bearing Witness to the Struggle for Civil Rights. The photographs are by Bob Edelman and essays are by Charles Johnson. They really make me feel like I've traveled back to the time of the 50s and 60s. And they help me not only see, but to feel the struggle that people felt during that time. So let's get started. Michael King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to the Reverend Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. They lived in this house with Mrs. King's parents, Reverend and Mrs. Williams. When Michael was 5 years old, his father changed their names from Michael to Martin Luther, after the famous Christian theologian Martin Luther. This house is now part of the U.S. National Park System, and it's like a museum. You can visit it in Atlanta. When Martin was a child, there were several places in the United States that were segregated. which means black people and white people did almost everything separately. They lived in different neighborhoods, attended different schools, and even drank from different water fountains. From grade school to high school, Martin's teachers recognized that he was very bright. Martin even skipped a few grades and graduated from high school early. When he was only 15 years old, Martin enrolled in college. He was proud to be a student at Morehouse College, a historically black college for men, which his father and grandfather had attended. After graduating from Morehouse in 1948, he enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, to study religion. This was the first school that Martin attended that was mostly had white students. He was one of only 11 black students. Pennsylvania didn't have the same segregation laws as Georgia, where Martin grew up. Martin even became class president and learned about Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent approach to social change. After Martin graduated from Crozer in 1951, he moved to Massachusetts to study at Boston University. In Boston, he met Coretta Scott, a student at the New England Conservatory of Music. They fell in love and were married on June 18, 1953. Martin received his doctorate degree in 1955 and became Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1954, Martin was offered a job at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was excited to preach. He believed it was his calling. But Martin knew that being a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, wouldn't be easy. It was one of the most racist, segregated cities in the South. You heard of Rosa Parks, right? Well, on December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, who was also the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, she refused to give up her seat on a bus and was arrested. Black leaders used her arrest as a reason to boycott the city's segregated buses. Dr. King was asked to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. Black residents refused to ride the city's buses until they were desegregated. The boycott lasted a whole year, and finally, the city decided to desegregate the buses. This was just the beginning of Dr. King's fight for civil rights. The Montgomery bus boycott showed the power of peaceful protests against segregation. Soon, they appeared throughout the South. In January 1957, Martin went to Atlanta for a meeting with Bayard Rustin, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and other black leaders. They formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, a civil rights organization. Martin was chosen as its president. The SCLC also worked on other civil rights issues like voting. Their crusade for citizenship began in late 1957 to help register black voters. Martin went to a march in Washington, D.C. called the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom and gave a speech called "Give Us the Ballot." In his speech, Martin told the crowd that black people were having trouble voting. He wanted to change that. The Kings moved to Atlanta in 1960. Martin liked being closer to the SCLC's headquarters. The move also made it easier to spend time with his family. Martin was even able to serve as his father's co-pastor. at Ebenezer Church, the same church he attended as a boy. In Atlanta, Martin organized events like sit-ins. Sit-ins were nonviolent protests where people refused to move from segregated areas. Throughout the South, sit-ins were popular, especially in shops and restaurants. Southern police officers knew Martin inspired others to protest. They tried to find reasons to arrest him. Once he was put in a Georgia jail for driving with an Alabama license. Thankfully, a congressman named John F. Kennedy helped him get out of jail. A few months later, Mr. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. In addition to sit-ins, Martin and his supporters participated in other nonviolent protests. They took freedom rides from the North to the South to challenge segregated buses. They held civil rights marches in many cities. Despite being arrested and jailed many times, Martin refused to give up. He would continue the fight for equality. In some places, like Birmingham, Alabama, things were worse for Black people than in other cities and states. In 1963, Alabama's new governor, George Wallace, made it known that he did not want segregation to end. Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, declared that he didn't care if protests were peaceful. He would order police to use violence. When the commissioner heard the SCLC planned to come to Birmingham, he was furious. He made it illegal for Martin to protest there. Martin knew he risked being arrested and jailed, but he decided to protest anyway. He knew it was the right thing to do. Birmingham's Black residents were excited Martin was coming. Hundreds of people planned to boycott white businesses. Teenagers and children planned a march called the Children's Crusade. But as they prepared for a peaceful protest, Commissioner Connor ordered police to spray the crowd with fire hoses. Police dogs attacked the protesters too. Many protesters were arrested along with Martin, including some of the young people from the Children's Crusade. As Martin sat in jail, he wrote a letter about how bad things were in the South. Martin's words were powerful. Despite what happened, he still did not believe in responding to violence with violence. His letter was read on national television. More people started to realize the need for change. Martin's letter from Birmingham jail is one of his most famous writings. The Birmingham campaign began on April 3rd and lasted over a month. Martin and his supporters refused to give up. The protest ended on May 10th after Birmingham's business leaders agreed to end segregation. In 1963, Martin worked with other leaders to plan an event called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people came in support of the March on Washington. Strangers linked arms as they marched and sang together. It was the largest showing of racial unity America had ever seen.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, honoring President Kennedy, who had been assassinated. After the tireless work of many civil rights leaders and their supporters, segregation had officially ended in the United States. Martin was proud and thankful. On October 14th, 1964, Martin was awarded the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize. At 35 years old, he is among the youngest people to ever win the prize. But Martin's work wasn't finished just yet. There was still a lot more he wanted to do for himself and the nation. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, people expected things to get better right away. But they didn't. Some cities chose to close schools rather than to desegregate them. One of those cities was Selma, Alabama. On March the 7th, 1965, several civil rights activists tried to peacefully march from Selma to Montgomery to protest unfair voting rules. They were met with violence from state troopers. The march and the violence were broadcast on television. It was so bad that the day became known as Bloody Sunday. People were very upset, including Dr. King. On March the 21st, he led a second march from Selma to Montgomery. This time, the peaceful protesters had protection with the Alabama National Guard. There was no violence. The 54-mile march took 5 days. Martin began with a small crowd of supporters, but by the time they reached Montgomery, the crowd had grown to 25,000 people. The march made a big impact on President Lyndon Johnson. On August 6, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended unfair rules that made it hard for Black citizens to vote. It was a historic moment for Martin and the country. Coretta and their 4 children continued to support Dr. King's important work. In April of 1968, Martin went to Memphis, Tennessee to help Black sanitation workers. They were protesting to be paid the same as the white workers. Sadly, it would be Martin's last protest. On April 4th, 1968, Martin's life ended when he was assassinated standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Throughout the world, people were saddened by Martin's tragic death. Thousands went to his funeral in Atlanta. A few days later, President Johnson honored Martin by signing the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law fulfilled one of Martin's last goals for equal housing rights. Even though Martin's life ended, people continued to support his dream, especially Coretta. In 1968, she created the King Center in Atlanta. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people visit to honor Martin's legacy. Dr. King is forever remembered as one of the world's greatest civil rights leaders. In 1977, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and in 2004, a Congressional Gold Medal. Today, people from all over the world travel to Washington, D.C. to visit the Martin Luther King Memorial. Those are some of the highlights of Dr. King's life. I hope that his life inspires you to make the world a better place.